the table as we continue our coverage here is Dr. Patrick Doran from the Nature Conservancy.
Hello, Christy.
Hi, and Gary Wilson, a commentator for the Great Lakes Echo. Now, gentlemen, it's great to have you here, and Patrick, I have to welcome you because last year you were with us in Detroit, and this is your first day of the conference. We're so glad you're back here with us.
It's great to be back. I came in late last night. I was very eager to get here, and I'm really fresh to go this morning and listen to what's going on and hear some of the great discussions.
All right.
Give him the hard questions.
All right,
Yeah.
we're gonna zoom in real tight.
All
We're gonna
right.
start giving the hard stuff,
I'm
and I'm
ready.
gonna say, solve algae blooms. Go. You know, we'll get into those discussions. But go ahead and tell us a little bit what you've been working on at the Nature Conservancy over the last year.
Yeah, it's been a year since the last conference in Detroit. We were with you. It's been a great year of action. As I mentioned last year, the Nature Conservancy really focuses around the Great Lakes. We collaborate amongst all our various state chapters, and we really are focusing on coastal systems, on forested systems, which we can't forget about, even though they seem very terrestrial in this discussion. That's where the water starts, and that's where the clean air starts. On the food web, on watersheds and agricultural places, on connections for the fish species to move up and down from our lakes to our streams. And we also focus on aquatic invasive species as well as climate change. So it's been a real year of action for every single one of those initiatives of ours.
And isn't that really what we want to see? We talked a lot last year and moving through this year that, okay, we've talked about it, now we're going to have to start to see some action. And you feel that we have?
Yeah, you know, when I look at the conservation, some people call it the conservation enterprise, right? It goes from the beginning of the science, identifying the problem, seeing the problem, the planning of using that science to address the issue, that addresses the things we care about, and then that informs the specific actions. And then we can't forget on the end, we got to kind of measure our success, reflect back, how have we done? What successes have we achieved? So I think this is the year where you really start seeing some of those actions and people kind of talking about some of those successes. We've seen some real movement.
We talked earlier, Gary, to Cameron Davis with the U.S. EPA, and he said that I think that we're going to look back in 20 years from now and say that this time period of 2011, 2012, 2013 is the most pivotal time for the Great Lakes. Would you agree with that?
I do. I'm not sure if it's for the same reasons, though, Christy. I think we're at a turning point here. And with the election and funding, all these issues that are kind of hanging out there. I was looking at the agenda earlier this morning for the Healing Our Waters Coalition, and one of their seminars is the fiscal train wreck that's coming, or potentially coming. And I think it's broader than that. We don't really know what's going to happen with the federal funding. We don't really know if there's a new administration, you know, will the Great Lakes be a priority? I think we are coming up on big decisions for the Great Lakes, and I'm not sure which way it's going to go.
Let's talk a little bit about the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and the funding that has been going on. So for the last 3 years, this has been implemented, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been put into projects. Are we starting to see the returns?
I believe so. If I look at some of the work the Nature Conservancy and partners are doing, I look up in the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, or in Green Bay, where we're really working on what we call aquatic connectivity. So reconnecting. What
does that mean?
Well, I was just going to go in there. Reconnecting our streams to the lakes, whether that's from some dams or old road stream crossings or things that block the river and the movement of fish species up and down. So for example, we've worked up in the Great Two-Hearted River watershed in the Upper Peninsula. If you don't know it from the Ernest Hemingway novels, you know it from the great beer from Bell's Brewery, the Two-Hearted River Ale.
It's a good ale.
It is, and so it's a very important stream. It's a stream that we have used GLRI money, Great Lakes Restoration money, to improve all the road stream crossings, stopping sedimentation and allowing fish to move up and down those streams. That watershed is now 100% connected. A fish can swim from Lake Superior to the upper reaches of that watershed to spawn. That gives fishing opportunities, promotes those fish species and healthy fish populations. We also seen great restoration work on our coastal watersheds. Here in Ohio, we're partnering with Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge on restoring hundreds of acres of coastal wetlands and restoring those, managing invasive species there like Phragmites, and that same type of work is happening in Erie Marsh in Ohio, in Michigan, is happening in Green Bay. So we're starting to see all those things hit the ground. Again, not just from the Nature Conservancy, but from all kinds of partners and conservation stakeholders who have received money through that funding.
And whether it's right or wrong, Gary, I think you have to see success stories like this in order to keep the money coming in, because if people don't see success and they're wondering where has our $800 million gone to?
Absolutely, and Cam Davis, who, like you said, was here this morning, Obama administration's point person for Great Lakes issues. That's one of his jobs, is going back and meeting with members of Congress, because he gets the hard questions. If they're going to pony up for more money, they want to see the results. So they want to see those legacy toxic hotspots. They want to see those getting nearer to be delisted. They want to see the dam removals where they make sense. They've really got the pressure on.
All right, so let's look at some of the top stories that have happened or things that have come to the forefront over the last year and everything that's changed. We talked a lot over the last year about algae blooms, and that has been a focus this first day of the conference. Do you think that, Patrick, that we're starting to, that we'll get a little bit more movement, or that's an issue that is now going to be one of the biggest focuses for Great Lakes health?
I do. I think it's a big issue. The funny or odd thing now is when we were talking last year at this point, we had a record algal bloom in terms of the size of it and the duration of it. This year, that algal bloom has not been quite as big, and people might think, oh, it's not as big a problem.
Yeah, that we should be done, and then we should move on to something else.
Right, but I think we have some other factors that are coming into play here, such as the changes in the climate this year. We had a lot less rainfall this year, which has a little bit less runoff from our agricultural systems, which is part of the reason we've had a little less intensity of the algal bloom. So while the algal bloom is still an issue, obviously still an issue, it also highlights the other issues that are happening in concordance with that.
What are the other big issues?
Well, one that I've been following since last year, but even way before that, cleaning up the toxic hotspots. North of Chicago, there's a harbor, Waukegan Harbor. It's the town of Waukegan, and for decades, that area was called one of the biggest PCB messes in the whole country. There have been a lot of political battles over who's supposed to do what, who's going to get the money, who's not going to get the money. But after over 20 years, they're getting real close to having that cleaned up. In fact, they're starting the dredging for the final cleanup, and that's going to be a big accomplishment, because that was just a political hot potato for a long time.
Patrick, you talked about climate change. You talked about the weather. We've all experienced it in some way or another over this last year and affecting agriculture. How big of a factor of climate is it when it comes to restoration of the Great Lakes and the health of the Great Lakes?
Well, one thing we've really been working on with a lot of organizations is how to think about climate and potential changes when you're doing your restoration actions. We're working closely with NOAA here in the Great Lakes, as well as with the University of Notre Dame, to kind of give people examples of how to approach thinking about climate and their restoration. And you have to. I'd point out a couple things. One thing we talked about, the changes. Another story is kind of lake level change. And also with the weather this year, you've seen some very dry periods, and that had some major influences on our cherry crops, on our apple crops. If you haven't noticed in the grocery store, there's less of those produce, and they cost
pretty
more.
Pretty pricey, yeah.
But I'm not saying that pattern you've seen this year is 100% due to anthropogenic climate change, but I am saying we have to be able to live with a future where that might be really clear or really predictable, or not predictable, but it may occur frequently. And so we, as a society, need to be able to handle those changes, whether that's in lake level changes or weather patterns. We need to build our systems and manage our systems that they can handle that change. And if we don't, if we think it's going to be stable all the time, that the temperature is going to be the same and the rain's going to be the same, then I think we get ourselves in trouble. A
little adaptation we have to learn, I think, Gary. Is that the bottom line here?
Yes, adapting is going to be key. Although we just can't let adaptation be a crutch for not doing things, though. And I really get sensitive to that. And if we just had a little bit more information, or we can't do anything now because we have to wait and see what happens next. There's got to be the balance. And I think Patrick and I have talked about that a few times. There has to be that critical balance of going when you've got enough information and not waiting until you get the last little kernel.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because during Great Lakes Week we have an awful lot of presentations. We talk about studies. We talk about issuing more studies. We talk about studying things when we're done with our studies in 3 years. Is there too much study and not enough action? Or is that changing a little bit? I'm going to start with you, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, Gary wrote a good article on this a couple weeks ago for the Great Lakes Echo, and it sparked some debate both online and internally with my staff and colleagues. And I think we generally come to the conclusion, I use the term the continuity of conservation, and it takes a little bit of everybody. It takes a village, right? It takes the scientists that are thinking about the problem, that see the problem, know how to approach the problem, It takes the planners that can make the links between that science and action, and it takes the people on the ground who are implementing those activities, whether it's toxic cleanups or wetland restorations or policies or rules or regulations that need to change. It takes all those things, and we need to do it in a way that we can tell whether they're successful or not. So I think our biggest problem is not making those connections between all those different components of the conservation community. And if we fail to make those connections and let the scientists do their thing and let the practitioners go over there and do their thing, again, we're not being as efficient as we could be.
What inspired you to write that, Gary?
Well, I just, there was another research institute opened up in northern Michigan, and I just got to thinking, how many areas of, how many institutes, universities study the Great Lakes issues? And I gave myself a little test without going to Google. I just wrote down all of the studies.
Impressive, because everyone goes to Google.
I know.
No.
And I really did not go to Google for the test, but all the studies I could name right off the top of my head, all the people who were doing research, and it seemed like a lot. Then I went and checked with Google and I found more. The interesting thing that came out of that article for me was that Patrick and Cameron Davis, coming from different angles, really came to the same conclusion. And there was no collaboration, no exchange of information. And I thought that was interesting. Now, I got blasted for that article by some people in the scientific community, which is fine. But Patrick and his staff brought a little levity to it.
Just a little bit of levity.
The conversations are always fun.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Things that have to be talked about. And speaking of have to be talked about, what are you expecting to hear the rest of the week at Great Lakes Week? What are you looking forward to hearing, Patrick?
I'm really looking forward to hearing some discussions about the agriculture environment, how we can best implement, best target our practices, be much more efficient. I think we're going to start things. Gets kind of boring, Christy, but I'm sorry, but I think we have to think about things like.
I love the science.
I'll be the science geek
I love
here.
the science. I love it.
We have to start talking about meaningful outcomes to the conservation world and to society.
What do you mean by meaningful outcomes?
Well, sometimes we measure our success by how many Farm Bill contracts we've done, or how many acres we put into a certain practice, or in the conservation world, how much dollars we've raised or how much land or acres of land we bought. That's not the outcomes we're looking for. We're looking for outcomes about conservation of the lakes and healthier of the lakes. Some people might say, wow, we need to enroll 100% of our farmers in some agricultural practices. I don't think it needs to be 100%. We need to enroll the right ones in the right conservation practices. Maybe that's 50%, maybe that's 25%, maybe that's 10%. We don't know. That's the kind of thing we have to figure out, and that's what I mean by the science that's really targeted. How much do we need? Where do we need that? What's the best return on your investment? So I'm talking about those types of outcomes. Again, not really that interesting, but I think it gets to the core of the issue.
Interesting enough, because again, we are a very, I think, measured society where we like to see 100% of this has been done, or 75% of this has been done, and that's how we can check the box and say, well, then we've done our job here.
And that's a trap. That's a trap that we can get ourselves into.
All right, so what are you looking forward to seeing in the next couple of days, Gary?
Well, I want to know, I'd like to hear what's good. The money is not probably going to become more, and I'm curious to see how the various agencies and the Healing Our Waters Coalition, how they're going, if they're going to be able to adapt and learn how to live with the status quo and money, or maybe even less. We really don't know what's going to happen after the election, depending on who is elected. I think there are two scenarios. One is the status quo will be maintained. The other scenario is we don't know, but it very likely the money could be cut further. So if we're going to keep restoration alive, how do we do that with limited or less money?
All right.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we simply look to the federal government for those dollars. Right. And I think there needs to be more discussion at conferences like this about the private foundations, the corporations,
the work that they're doing,
the society, the members of our society, you know, us as individuals that live here. And I think what's great about, I think the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has done, and some of these conferences being held in conjunction with one another, is we begin to see conservation and the Great Lakes in our everyday language. The mayor said today that the Great Lakes are essential in every bit of Cleveland, the health of Cleveland, the viability of Cleveland. It is part of Cleveland. We need to see that theme throughout society so that we all are investing in the Great Lakes.
And have a connection. All right, Dr. Patrick Doran, the Nature Conservancy, Gary Wilson, commentator of the Great Lakes Echo. They're going to be with us throughout Great Lakes Week, and your commentary and your insight is so well appreciated. So thanks, guys. We'll get back to you in just a little